Hi, and welcome to week 11, lesson plan and materials adaptation. This week, you do not have any readings or viewings because I want you to put all of your time and energy towards this application assignment where you are revising a lesson plan and its materials to make it more responsive to multilingual learners. Now, the idea for this activity or for this assignment emerged from a real need that I was seeing in schools and in my work with teachers, which specifically was that many teachers were given curricula, were given lesson plans that they had to teach, but were given limited tools and resources sometimes to be able to make those lessons really responsive to their students. And given that this is such a core skill that any teacher of multilingual learners should develop, I wanted to devote an entire week of this course to having you apply what you've been learning so that you can think about how you can take your day-to-day instructional materials and adapt them in ways that make them more responsive for your students and help to better meet your multilingual learners' needs. So for this activity, you can please read the assignment description and rubric if you haven't read it through already to make sure you know exactly what to focus on in terms of how you'll be adapting the materials and lesson. But I encourage you to select a lesson that you will teach so that you can make it a really applied exercise. Or if you're not currently a practicing teacher, choose a lesson plan that's in the grade level that you want to teach or that is within the content area that you plan to teach. And so you'll start with that lesson, and you'll be adapting it in several ways. So first, you want to make sure that the lesson plan includes content and language objectives. So you're planning for both the content learning that will occur, but also the specific language goals that you have. And I encourage you to go back to our week where we looked at language objectives to look again at kind of how you identify the language demands of a lesson, how you think about not just the demands of the lesson in terms of language, but also the language that students might need to be successful and the language you might want to support students in developing. So what kind of academic language can you embed in this lesson that relates to the content learning goals? So you'll be building in both your content and language objectives. The second piece is you'll be looking across the lesson and planning intentional scaffolds to support speaking, listening, reading, and writing. So we've talked about those different domains throughout this course, and you'll be thinking about incorporating some specific scaffolds. And I encourage you to draw from some of the different strategy ideas that you either showcased in your strategy assignment or that you observed one of your colleagues, one of your classmates using, or one that you read about that you found pretty compelling. So I should see evidence that across the lesson, there are intentional scaffolds that are built in to support students to engage across all those domains of language. Third, you're going to be incorporating at least one strategy for learning new vocabulary. So choose a lesson where there can be some vocabulary learning embedded. And then I want you to choose something that you learned from the week that we focused on vocabulary that can be explicitly embedded into this lesson. Next, I want you to think about assessment, both formative and summative. And while in a given lesson, you might not have a large scale summative assessment, what I mean by that distinction here is that I want you to think about ways throughout the lesson that you're looking at and evaluating student learning and how students are coming to understand whatever the content is, whatever the language goals are, or how they're coming to engage in the skills that they're practicing. And then also something summative, holistic at the end of the lesson as a way for you to capture their learning. So that doesn't mean you need to give them a test in the lesson. I mean, you can think about exit tickets. You can think about anecdotal records where you might be taking notes about student talk in a given moment. But think about where throughout the lesson you are building in those touch points for you to understand student learning. And again, you can definitely draw from last week, our work on assessments as you're thinking about what to build into your lesson. And then finally, your adapted lesson should also include clear differentiation for MLLs at different levels of second language acquisition. So I want to see at least one example where you're differentiating, whether that means providing differentiated text, whether that means you are differentiating the activity that students are engaging in, perhaps in your grouping. You might have evidence of how you're thinking about differentiating. You might even create an MPI strand, one of the WIDA MPI strands, to show how you're differentiating across different levels. But there should be some evidence in your lesson that you're thinking about how students at different levels of English language acquisition could be engaging in your lesson. So that is what I'm asking you to do in terms of the lesson plan itself. You also should show me that you can differentiate and adapt instructional materials. So for example, you might take a graphic organizer that was already a part of the lesson, part of the curricula that you were given, and you might add sentence frames and visuals to it. You might add a word bank. You might create multiple versions of the same handout to give students, differentiating the materials that you're giving students. You might take a text that you're using and you might adapt it or amplify it in some way so that it's more accessible to students. You might create multiple versions of a worksheet. So lots of different strategies and ideas for how you can do this. But what I want to see is evidence throughout that you're thinking about the materials and making specific changes to make them more accessible and to better meet the needs of the MLLs in your classroom. You can either hyperlink these materials into the lesson plan and make sure that they're accessible. So if I click on them, I can get to them, or you can include them in the appendix of the paper of the lesson plan. And so there is a paper component where you're going to explain what you did. It doesn't have to be long, 2 to 3 pages is fine. If you need a little bit more space, you're welcome to add a couple more pages to that. But really, I just want you to be explaining what changes did you make, and then give me some rationale for why. And the rationale, again, as with all assignments in this course, should clearly connect to some of the SLA theories and concepts that we've been learning about. So explain to me, for example, why you incorporated visuals on a handout that didn't previously have them. So you might talk about comprehensible input, right? Making that input more accessible by having a visual alongside the word. Or if you are incorporating a text in a student's home language, or some strategic grouping where a student is sitting next to someone who shares their same language background while they're engaging in a turn and talk exercise and discussing their prior knowledge. You might connect that to translanguaging or to cross-linguistic transfer, talking about the benefits that we know that happen when students can draw upon their full linguistic repertoire to make meaning. So kind of talk me through some of the changes that you made and how those connect to some of the core ideas that you've been learning about in this course and throughout the TESOL program, TESOL BDL program around supporting multilingual learners and SLA theory. So that is it. Again, that's your only assignment for this week. So I look forward to looking at your responsive lesson plans and materials and seeing how you've been taking everything that you've been learning so far into this course to adapt a lesson and make it more responsive for your multilingual learners.